and has meaning. Each moment is meant to be experienced and cherished. Welcome to Anxiety Simplified Podcast. I'm Joanne Williams, and I'm going to share ways to refocus this anxiety energy to a more productive and effective way to go through life. You already have all the tools. I'll just remind you how to use them. We'll be tuning into your own power to choose and find more joy and peace. Let's get started remembering this wisdom. Well, welcome back. Joanne Williams here with Anxiety Simplified, and this is part 2 with Jack Ori. And part 1 was about his kind of living authentically as a transgender man. Now, and today we're going to be talking about, additionally, he was diagnosed and understood in his 30s that he also is on the spectrum for having autism. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about autism and some of the early signs. And, the question is, how has it affected his life, or how has it been so that he was able to possibly use this to his own good, or some positive things that have happened in his life. So Jack, welcome back. And we're going to just start today talking a little bit about autism and maybe how that has affected living your life authentically.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
definitely. I would say the biggest thing was not being diagnosed until my 30s, because as a child, I guess you would say, a loner for a lot of the time. I was a kid who was a very advanced reader. By the time I was in first or second grade, I was reading on a college level.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and I always had my nose in a book. And part of the reason was because I loved to read, but part of the reason was because I didn't know how to relate to the other kids. So while they were on the playground doing what they were doing, I was reading a book, not really interacting with them and not really knowing how to interact with them. And it wasn't that I didn't have any friends, because I did have friends as a child. But as we got older, it became more difficult because I didn't really understand how to relate to them. So, and it's all mixed up together with being transgender and having autism, because with the autism, if social cues are difficult, not knowing what to say or what not to say is difficult, sometimes being too blunt or coming off as rude, that kind of thing. But also being transgender and acting more masculine than expected could also, both of those things kind of excuse me, kind of interacted. But I would say that once I was diagnosed as an adult, it was a lot easier for me because everything just makes sense.
Oh, let me just have you ask you a question. So just take a break. Um, so once you were diagnosed, that helped you to be able to accept yourself a little bit more, and the
I think so.
understanding
Yeah,
also, but did that help you accept yourself more
I
too?
think so, because I think it all made some sort of sense. As a kid, I was the kind of kid who was very strong willed. I had tantrums a lot. I didn't always get along with other kids. I was very direct and very blunt. I didn't always understand things. And I would be very, like I said, in certain areas, like with reading, I was very, very advanced. In other areas, not so advanced. And that can always feel weird when you know that you're an intelligent person. You're like, I'm intelligent, but why can't I get these normal things that other people do? That can create this sort of disconnect where it's like, what's wrong with me that I have the brains to do these brilliant things, but at every job I've ever been at, I get into trouble because I don't know how to socialize with other people. And that becomes a big issue with the job market, because a lot of jobs are all about socializing.
Yeah.
You can do great work, but like, I come there and I want to work, and the person next to me comes there and wants to like talk, and that
Yeah.
could create problems, because if you're not seen as like a friendly team player, then they don't want you on their team.
So that affected your finding jobs or keeping jobs?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you were going to talk to parents or even maybe some older kids that are wondering about some of these things, or are you familiar with some of the earlier signs? I think you were just talking about them, but maybe you could just kind of name them a little bit more that
Yeah.
might be a indicator for a parent.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends because the first thing knows autism is the spectrum. A lot of people think of autism as the very low end of the spectrum where you have the kids who don't talk and are rocking back and forth and that are very difficult to understand or don't really know what's going on with them. But that's only one end of the spectrum. There's a whole spectrum, and at the higher end, there could be all sorts of things that may or may not apply to your child. Like, the stereotypical side is eye contact. And with kids at the higher end, sometimes it's not always that you don't look at the person, sometimes that you look at them too much. Um, like, because there's not this understanding of how to do it. So, like, a child has what I have used to be called Asperger's. Now they got rid of that label in the DSM-5, and it's all autism spectrum disorder. But anyway, so like some people with autism, like someone will tell them you need to look into someone's eyes when you talk to them, and they'll take that
Yeah.
literally, and the whole conversation they'll be like this,
Staring
So
into their eyes, if you're listening to the podcast, just staring at somebody with big eyes. Yeah.
right, so having that kind of difficulty, or maybe like looking at the wrong part of somebody, like instead of like you're making eye contact, you're not really looking in their eyes, you're looking like at a different part of their face, or you're looking not in a sexual way, but looking like at their chest because that's just where your
Yeah.
eyes happen to land. That
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Or
Like,
if you're tall or short, yeah,
yeah,
that could make a difference.
that
Okay.
can make a difference too. So those kinds of things. Some people take things very literally. Like that's another like stereotypical autism sign is like the kid who you say that you give a figure of speech and they don't get it, which not all people who have that are autistic. Like one of my nieces does that. She doesn't have autism, but I remember when she was like 2, one time I said, I was coloring before, I said, I'm tired of doing this. And she said, why don't you take a nap? And, so if your kid is older and is doing those kinds of things, that might be something to look at. But again, it's not necessarily. Definitely, if they're having issues with their social skills, if they're having trouble making friends, you want to try to see what could be going on. Do they need some more social skills training? Like,
Yeah.
and I think it's always important to look at how the behavior is affecting them is the most important thing. Like, is it affecting them academically? Is it affecting them emotionally? Because the word is just a word. It's just a description of a bunch of different behaviors, right? It doesn't mean anything outside of how does that affect this person. So
Yeah.
it's more important to be like, my child is struggling socially, let's figure out why, than to be like, my child is has autism. Like, but having said that, the other thing is, if you do get a diagnosis, I think it is important to share that with your child. When I was first diagnosed, afterward, because I'm so what's called high functioning, I was asked by the therapist there if I would talk to the parent of another person who was recently diagnosed. And this person was quote unquote diagnosed as an adult, but they actually were diagnosed as a child, and the parents didn't tell them until they turned 18. So that created all sorts of issues for them, as you might imagine. And the parent was well intentioned. It wasn't like an evil kind of thing. It was the parent being like, I don't want him to have a label. I don't want him to be stigmatized. I don't want him to think of himself as lesser than. So I'm just not going to tell him until he's older. But then when the person found out, they felt betrayed. They felt like, I don't know who I am. I can't trust my parents and that kind of thing. So I would just recommend, if you do get a diagnosis, explain it to your child in an age appropriate way. You don't have to go into a lot of details, but if you have a kid who's 6, 7, 8 years old, you can explain to them you have something called autism. Your brain works a little differently than other people. and we're going to work with your teachers and maybe some special teachers to help you make friends and learn what you need to learn in school, that kind of thing.
And so you're describing it as something that can be learned, skills to
Right.
help with this. So that's another thing I would take from this, that this can be looked at as something that can be learned in
Right.
a different way for their child. It's not just they will
Right.
never, they can't. It's
Right.
they
I
need
mean,
to learn
yeah,
it.
it does depend on the child, of course. Like you said,
Yeah.
it's a spectrum. So some kids will, if they're nonverbal, it's going to be a different experience than if they're
Right.
fully verbal.
Right.
And I imagine if you have a child who's nonverbal, you're not really going to be explaining to them that they have autism because you don't know if they understand or not. But if you
Jack,
let,
Jack, can I ask, do you happen to know the percentage of children that is the extreme, or what, like, if there's a spectrum with the highest functioning, a percentage of compared to, the nonverbal. I would assume in the middle is where most kids
right, that's what I would think. Yeah, I
are.
don't know for sure. I don't know specific numbers.
Okay.
But I know that in recent years, there's been more emphasis on high functioning. Like people with high functioning autism in the past when they get diagnosed because,
Ah,
they didn't have those extreme symptoms. And that's why, because there are people who think that vaccines cause autism, which there's no scientific evidence for that. I just want to say
okay.
that that's not actually been shown by science. But one of the arguments that I see sometimes is, well, there have been more vaccinations in the past 30 years and more diagnoses in the past 30 years. That's because we understand more about what autism is. We understand that someone like me can be autistic and it's not just the nonverbal or barely verbal people. And I think that that's something that people don't always realize, that sometimes they're like, well, my child walks and talks and seems like a normal child, except they're quirky. So how can you say they have autism?
Right.
But
Yeah.
on a higher end, you see that particularly with what used to be called Asperger's, people like me would develop normally and just have these some deficits in certain areas. Like one story I always tell is when I started first grade, I didn't know any of the other kids in my class. And the first day of first grade, I walked in the classroom, I looked around, the only seat was next to someone I didn't know. And I didn't want to sit there because I didn't know her. So I went and I sat at a back table. The teacher came in and she said, in a bright voice that first grade teachers use, "Oh, well, you can't be at the back table. Let's find you a seat." And took me to a seat next to another child. But there was no realization that it wasn't that I didn't see there was a
Right.
seat.
Right. Yeah. And I don't even know how they don't even think that. I mean, they don't go there at all.
Right.
So I could
And I
see
do
the
think it's a
confusion.
a little bit better now. I think
Yeah.
nowadays there's more emphasis on socialization and
Yeah.
social skills than there were. And that's I think a good thing because you don't necessarily need to single out a child with autism for that.
Right.
I think that's the kind of thing where it's like, if you know how like they have a music class for 30 minutes a week or art class, if they had a 30-minute a week social skills class that all the
Yeah.
kids went to, I think that would be good for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think in that class, we talk about bullying and how we treat each other and how, what do we do when somebody does call you a name? I think to me, that is so needed.
I think so too, because we have so many issues with all sorts of bullying and things. And
Yes.
kids with autism, unfortunately, are often a target for bullies because they're seen as weird. I think that one of the things that needs to change is to teach all kids that if a child is acting in a way that you don't act, that's as long as they're not hurting anyone else, that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things I have read, and I just want to get your opinion. I don't want to say that you're an expert on this or anything or put you on the spot. But one thing I had read about a lot of time, children with autism can be more sensitive emotionally. and also within their bodies to foods and colorings and things like that. Have
Oh yeah,
you heard that or read that also?
yeah. That definitely. That's something I definitely want to mention because sometimes, and this is partially thanks to the way it's depicted in our media, people think that people with autism have no emotions or no empathy. And the opposite is true. Like studies have shown that people with autism are so empathetic that sometimes they shut down because they get around someone and they feel all their feelings and like, you know, it's very overwhelming for them. And so sometimes people think that means they don't have empathy, they don't care, they're selfish. That's not generally the case.
And can you speak to anything about those sensitivities? Do you feel
Yeah,
like there is
there is.
more
Yeah, there is
sensitive?
definitely more sensitivity. And again, I think it's something that does happen with non-autistic kids too. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, one of my
Okay.
nieces is not autistic, very sensitive to noise to the point that like when they first moved in, they lived near a train station, and when they first moved in, she would get upset when the trains went by because it's noisy. And she's not autistic, but for an autistic person, that could be even worse. Like
Yeah.
I can't stand flickering lights to the point that I was once at the mall with my friends and there was a light overhead that was flickering where I was sitting and I just froze for a minute. Like, I cannot deal with this light. And that's the kind of thing that people are not always generally aware of. Like, there are things you can do for that. Like, if I know I'm going to be going to a place where there's disco lights, I'll wear sunglasses or not go there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That
Absolutely.
kind of thing.
And you're bringing up something else that I'm thinking about that can be confusing. There are learning disabilities as
Right.
well outside of autism or outside of anything that can also present as some of these things like you're
Right.
talking about, that some kind of processing problems can appear in a
Right.
way or.
Right. I think that especially like with ADHD, there's a lot of crossover. And when I was teaching special ed, a lot of my autistic children were first misdiagnosed as ADHD, and then they were like, "That's not
Oh,
quite
really?
right." And I think because with ADHD, you also have the child may not be focused, or the child may say whatever comes into their head without thinking, or the child
Impulsive.
is impulsive, and
Yeah.
or a child is extremely strong-willed. Like all of those things can happen with ADHD or with autism, and so sometimes it can be confusing. And then there are people who have both. So
Yeah. Oh, all right. So what would, have you seen some positives with this, or how can we look at this if a parent is hearing this, or maybe an older teenager or child,
yeah,
or even
definitely.
adult? What have you seen as maybe even a positive to this, or
Yeah,
something you should tell them that might be helpful?
yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, autism does not mean you cannot be successful. That's the first thing that I
Aha,
always want to tell
yay.
people. One resource I often tell people, look at the story of Temple Grandin.
Yes,
She
good.
is she
Look at
has
that. There's a great,
yeah,
I think it's Netflix or Amazon. Find that movie,
yeah,
Temple Grandin.
yeah.
She has
She
created more
is amazing.
things.
I actually had the
Yes.
opportunity to see her in person once.
You did?
She
Oh,
spoke when I was living in North Carolina. She did a speech at one of the local universities, so I went there. And I will say that sometimes her speech was a little hard to follow because it's very stream of consciousness. Like she
uh-huh.
would start talking about one thing and then she would be like, "Oh, and by the way," and go on to an entirely different topic. And I went with the therapist who diagnosed me, and they were both like, "How did you follow that? I could not follow that." And so there's things like that. And the other thing was like she did a meet and greet, and I could tell she was very uncomfortable, like with people taking their picture. And I really thought they should not have put
Mm,
her through that because
yeah.
she didn't. I could tell she didn't like it. She was very stiff. She was not looking at the people, and I think that the flash was probably bothering her. But she was a very impressive speaker with all her PhDs and all her knowledge. And the difference was because I've read some of her books as well,
Yes, I
that
did too.
when her mother was told she wouldn't amount to anything because she had autism and was told put her in an institution, and she refused to do that. And she said, "I get to teach her at home." And she took her home and she hired speech therapists. And of course, some of this has to do with money, right? Like,
Right,
so not
right.
everyone has the ability to do that, which is another problem. That's something
And
that's
Claire Danes, I think she won an Oscar, or I think it was an Oscar for that movie. I mean, it is something to see.
yeah,
The
it is definitely
inventions
the
she
inventions. Yeah,
created. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, that you can
so
be
definitely
successful.
you can be successful. And with autism, the negative is that it's very difficult to socialize. It can be hard. It can be harder to be with people. But the positive is that most people with autism don't have a problem being alone, and you can be super focused on what you're doing. Like for me as a writer, like even with this pandemic that's going on, obviously there's still anxiety. There's still always the anxiety of, am I going to catch the disease? And that kind of thing. But the issue of quarantining is not as hard for me as a person with
Just
autism because I don't mind being alone. Like, and in some ways, it's like now I don't have to socialize. Nobody
and it
can.
makes it easier because you don't have to socialize.
Right.
Okay. All right.
So I will say, like, I have a friend who has a son with autism also, and she's always posting about some of the things he says that she finds are so funny or amusing. People with autism have very unique insights into things, and sometimes they can be funny. Like one of my friends used to tell a story. There was a movie or TV show or something that came out called The Shape of Water, and her son who had autism,
Oh,
every time
yeah.
he saw that commercial, he would get mad, and he would be like, "Water does not have a shape. This is a stupid title."
And there's that, what do you call that?
That literalism.
Met literally
Yeah.
not being able to be, yeah, you take things literally. Oh, interesting. Oh, that's fun. As a therapist, one of the things I do is I certify people to have an emotional support animal. And a lot of the clients I deal with do have social anxiety, agoraphobia, which is really preferring to stay home and not liking to be in crowds.
Right.
And so it is interesting. I hear the same thing from them. It's like, hey, this is a great thing. I don't have to be around all those people that I really make me feel uncomfortable. So interesting. You're
Yeah.
finding the same thing.
Yeah. And I definitely think, we are as a society are very what's the word? We prefer people who are extroverted. Like
Yes.
they're introverted people are seen as what's wrong with you? You're supposed to want to socialize. And I think that's a shame
Yeah.
because
Well, you know what? After being an introvert and understanding, one of the books I liked was Introvert's Advantage. That 3/4 of the population are extroverts. So I think that percentage with only 25% being introverts, I think in itself lends it to that lack of understanding and preference because most people are extroverts.
right.
So
Most people are right-handed too. So.
and most people are right-handed. That wasn't even acceptable. My poor husband, who had left-handed, they made him for baseball be right-handed. It was not accepted.
I'm
And you have
left-handed.
to write with your right hand. You have to.
Yeah. Well, I actually, when I was little, I was ambidextrous, and I remember
Oh,
through school or kindergarten, one of the teachers being like, "Are you a righty or a lefty?" And I said, "I'm a bothie," and they were like, "That's not acceptable. You have
you
to choose."
can't have that.
So I chose the left. Since then, I've been left-handed.
Yeah, and that's the more creatives. So interesting. Well, Jack, this has been really wonderful. And again, I want people you to have some last words, and I want them to know how to get a hold of you, and any things that you might recommend for parents or understanding as some last words.
Yeah, definitely. The first thing I want to do is say directly to people who have autism, don't let anyone feel like you're less than or that they have a monopoly on the truth. One thing that happened to me was somebody that I thought was a friend at the time. If they didn't like something I was doing, they would not put it as I don't like that. They would always say, "Oh, people don't like that." So that I thought, "Oh, this is a rule I don't know because I have autism." And later on, I found out it was not. So just don't let anyone do that to you. Like, make sure that, like, if you are struggling to make friends, know that the right friends will accept you for who you are, and
Oh, that's
don't let anyone make you feel inferior because you have autism. And if you are a parent, you know, I salute you because it can be very difficult to deal with a child's autism or other disability. Know you're doing the best you can and try as best as you can to be positive, because if no matter how frustrating it is, you don't want your child to get the feeling that mom or dad would love me more if I didn't have autism, which I'm sure is not
or
the
like
case.
my brother and sister are. Yeah.
So, you know, you want to make sure to foster those positive feelings as much as you can. Praise them for the things they're doing well. Like, everyone, I think they're doing well. Even people with autism who might be
I
struggling in
love
one
that.
area. So I think those are important things to get out there. If you want to get in touch with me, the easiest way is my website is jackaori.com. And right now, I have a guide that I think kids with autism will particularly like. Um, 6 ways that teens who can't blend in can learn to love standing out. And you can get that at my website, jackaori.com/love standing out.
I love it. Oh, and I'll have it in the show notes as well. Oh, Jack, thank you so much for your time. And I think you've really put a lot of really important information and facts out there that parents and youth can use. And that's what we're really all about here at Anxiety Simplified. So I really thank you. And I'll I'm going to see you soon because we're in a group together. So this is nice too that we get to continue this discussion. Um, but I will say thank you again. And our next podcast will be with Karen Schwartz and I shouldn't. It's Schultz. Sorry, Karen. Karen Schultz, creating an awesome life, which I think is a really good one to continue this story from Jack's into building an awesome life. Is I think a really wonderful intention and goal for all of us, no matter what. We all have some kind of what we would call disability. If it's just being shy and not wanting to go into social situations or whatever it is, I always call it, we all have something.
Oh,
So thank you so much, Jack.
thank you.
Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Please support our podcast by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. Please, to show your support. And remember to use and practice a skill we shared today to feel the joys of life. Remember, you can always call us 760-485-6784 for that free 10-minute consultation where we can discuss your next step. Or you can go to our website at anxietysimplified.net for more on how to get certified for an emotional support animal today. And remember to share the love.